My topic is the future of mobility. We call this disruptive technologies create new realities. Maybe a quick background on myself before we launch into that. So, as Glenn said, we've known each other for many years. Actually, I've known Jeff for many years, known Lori for many years. I haven't met Jeff Stout before, so we'll get to know each other. I started actually in the auto industry with one of the big OEMs, the biggest at that point, General Motors, back in the 70s. So it's been over 40 years now in the auto industry. Worked in the industry, worked in manufacturing on the shop floor, worked with other parts of GM back in those days. Were aerospace as well as automotive. And then I've been in consulting now for over 30 years. And so at Plante Moran, I lead our strategy consulting group across all industries, and I lead our automotive industry consulting group. And so the research team and our folks in that area report up into me. And we undertook this task going back a few years ago when I was consulting with the Department of Energy on some of the electric technologies. And so we had the chance at that point to work with some of the big names like a Tesla that were out there. So we actually had many meetings with Elon and his team back in the days when Elon would say he was homeless in those days. I don't think he's homeless today, except when he's living in his tent outside trying to get the Model 3 production up. But also with, with Nissan and the Leaf, but also with some that were kind of duds, like the Fisker. If any were suppliers to Fisker on the Karma. It's trying to resurrect itself now, as well as probably 100 other different suppliers and OEMs, startups, a lot of them, that were trying to take advantage of some of the money that was available. This is going back 10 years ago in the middle of the crisis that the Department of Energy had. So it's the germination for the kind of this whole idea of projecting the future really started with that. And it's evolved now into what I'd like to talk about today, which is a projection or forecast model that we have around this idea of autonomous and mobility and sharing and electric and manufacturing, how these all converge together. And a lot of this information is going to be very consistent with what you've heard already. We have some differing views, as Craig mentioned, and so it'll be interesting to get in that discussion as well. So with that, I'm going to launch into the presentation. We'll go through some of this fairly quickly. I think the presentation will be available for people as well, and I'm open to, we can talk about that during the Q&A as well as afterwards. Quickly about Plante Moran, many of you know who we are, but the quick debrief is that we've been around for 94 years, so going back to 1924. It's accounting, tax, as well as consulting, as well as some other services around real estate and site selection and investment banking and wealth management and a number of other areas. We have over 3,000 people in Plante Moran now, and we've expanded. We're primarily in the Midwest. We're now expanding westward with the addition of another firm just a few weeks ago, headquartered in Denver, but the offices are all over the place out there, and heavily into more of the energy space. We also have a worldwide network as well as our offices in Monterey and Shanghai and Mumbai and in Tokyo. And I'm in the strategy area, as I mentioned. I lead the strategy consulting group, and my main focus is also probably with the automotive group and automotive suppliers especially. And I'd say a big chunk of our consulting clients are automotive suppliers, just like yourselves out there. Many of you are our clients already. So this picture Jeff showed earlier too. So it's a bit of a repeat. The context, we usually like to do this presentation. We've done it probably almost 20 times in the last 6 months for groups like this, but also individually with our clients. So I would say that that's been very helpful to get your management teams together in many cases and have this brainstorming session for an hour or two. And it's a good way to kick off a strategy session, frankly, as a way of trying to get everybody thinking a little differently. And not everybody agrees, but the key part about starting off, especially with a slide like this, is disruptive change. And this was 118 years ago, right? That's the point Jeff was making earlier. Easter morning in New York City, and look for the automobile, and there's one, and it's all horse and buggy. And then only 13 years later, almost to the day, Easter morning, he found I could never find that horse in there. So you can barely see him. It's all cars. So industry gone, not gone, but it's just a lot smaller. Completely new environment out here with cars, with streets now instead of dirt roads. The guy who scoops up the manure on the streets is probably out of business. It's an unfortunate casualty maybe, but he probably got a lot better job after that. Let's hope so anyway. But that's the kind of disruption that I believe we're facing. And after being in the industry over 40 years, it's amazing to me when some people say that I don't believe it's going to happen. So to me, it's not, the technology is already out there. It's already available and it works. It's a matter of when. When do we think it will occur? And that's really what our attempt at trying to forecast the future is all about. What are the drivers to make the when happen? And then from your standpoint, thinking about what do you have to do to make sure that you're ready when it happens? What do you need to do to get your company positioned to take advantage of that in the future, similar to what YF was talking about earlier. So we build it around these 4 major drivers, starting with autonomy, actually, because we think that each of these enables the next layer for a disruptive change to occur. So the idea of an autonomous or self-driving vehicle, we think, is absolutely crucial to making mobility and sharing actually occur in any kind of volume. Because the single biggest challenge to sharing, which we were talking about at lunch as well, is access to the vehicle. So if I have to walk 2 miles to get to the vehicle, or I have to get a ride to get there, like we do with rental cars today, then it's a disincentive. Now some people say, oh, well, no, what about Uber? Uber will come pick you up. And that is true. And that's where Uber and Lyft and these companies have made a tremendous business model. However, it's an expensive business model. If you look at it on a cost per mile, you're paying for a chauffeur to drive you around is what you're doing. And our people have looked at this and really drilled down into what drives our transportation behavior. And cost per mile is one of the single biggest things that affects us, even if we don't think about cost per mile all the time. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But access to the vehicle, autonomy enables access to that vehicle anywhere that you want to be. With a self-driving vehicle to come get you, take you where you want to go, drop you off, another one can come get you later, if you think about it conceptually like that. Likewise, the idea of autonomous and sharing, we think actually really helps accelerate electric. Because there's a lot of electrification already, but it's on the slow uptake. It's that linear line right now. It's not really taking off at this point in time. And one of the challenges, frankly, is not only the cost, which is high, but also the life of the batteries, the range of the battery that the electric vehicle can take you. Those factors, we think with autonomous and shared actually are really disappear for the most part. Because if, for example, if I'm driving out here to Albion today, which I came in from the southeast Michigan area, if my battery were to get low, or maybe if it's low right now, it drops me off, I get another car and keep going. Okay, it's a matter of making sure the swap gets scheduled sufficiently. Probably I do need to get out of the vehicle once in a while too. There's certain biological things that have to happen out there. But the idea of electric, if the battery gets low as well, if it drops me off, then it should go off and self-drive and then park and then charge. And it'll be able to recharge itself. We'll have a fleet of these autonomous shared vehicles potentially out in the future that can take us around. So it's a bit science fiction-like, but we think that's a huge enabler to making electric really happen in a high volume way, beyond all the efforts that are going into it at this point in time. Beyond government controls, by the way. The last part we think, though, that really just provide a huge opportunity for a group like this, because we're very optimistic about the future, if you didn't pick that up already, for the automotive industry. We are not naysayers at all, but we think the supplier has a huge role in this in the future. The manufacturing of the vehicle, we think, will change dramatically. As you talk about changing the architecture of the vehicles, what the requirements are of the vehicle, and who's going to spend the money to develop these vehicles, we think yourselves if you're positioned correctly, can really take advantage of this and really become a critical player in this manufacturing of the vehicle in the future, because somebody still has to make the stuff. So even though some people think that all the OEMs will be out of business in 20 years, that's great, but somebody's still got to go out and make 100 million vehicles globally, right, to make it work. Even if it's half that much, they still got to make them. We think it's going to be more, actually. So this you've already aware of. So we go through this to educate the client sometimes, because everybody's not real clear about the level of autonomy. I think that's been talked about here, but this, when we talk about self-driving and autonomous, the Tesla, the autopilot's really more like a 2.5 in here. I think the Cadillac Super Cruise is like a 2.5, somewhere in that range. So this is all in the test phases out here, as far as fully autonomous vehicles that drive around by themselves. And time-wise, we think that's going to continue for a while in more of a testing environment. So in this view, this is one that's been developed by others in the past as well, as far as these different phases and this idea of geofencing. But it's similar to what Jeff was talking about, setting up this area where you can actually build, you can test the autonomous vehicles and see how they work. As we sit here today, it's really interesting when people kind of say, well, where is this happening? There's over 100 different locations in this country right now that are doing this. And there's over 20, I think there's about 20 in Michigan alone. Now they're small, they're not real big, Someone was talking about it at lunch in Detroit. Quicken Loans has got their own version of this going on. It's a very short route, slow speed, but they have a need to move thousands of young employees around that don't necessarily, there's no place for them to park, for one thing, to get around there. But that's, we think over the next 2, 3, maybe a few more years, a lot of this kind of testing is going to go on. We'll get smarter about it so that we don't run into people and kill them, hopefully. I mean, that's an unfortunate thing that happens with some of this, because in some cases it wasn't maybe as controlled or disciplined as what it should be. But then we think it'll grow. And similar to that picture that Jeff was showing, this is a picture of New York City and the boroughs in New York City, and how you could grow a small geographic area, geofence it, and slowly as you get more confidence, trust, the liabilities are all put in place, you can expand it. And we believe that that's where the model for autonomous will end up growing. It'll start in the urban areas because that's where the need is the most, and it'll slowly grow out. And the only question is there really a limit in the future? If you go out to 2030 and beyond, this is the whole United States. Is there going to be a limit to that in the future? We're not sure. However, I would argue that maybe not so much of a limit. Maybe if you're on a farm way out in the country somewhere, the need for it may decline. At the same time, I would say that farmer, for example, from an agricultural equipment standpoint, would like to have an autonomous tractor that runs around in the fields so he can go do something else. So there's a lot of interesting evolutions of this that can occur. So we'll move a little quicker through here. This is, and the model itself, what we put together is this is today's version of transportation, where you drive it yourself, or you rent it, or you use a taxi, or you take a bus in some cases. And in the model, we've categorized this into 3 different types of transportation. One being, there's one that's still privately owned still. It's not shared. This group here would probably make above average incomes in here. We still want to own our own vehicle, but it will have autonomous capabilities. And in fact, there'll probably be requirements as we geofence these areas that it goes into an autonomous mode at certain points. So we're not allowed to actually make a mistake ourselves, and the computer shouldn't make that kind of mistake. It may stop abruptly all the time, Glenn, like that, because it's not going to go over 55. It says if it's 55 miles an hour, but I'm sure somebody will figure out, some enterprising young mechanic is going to figure out a way to break into the system so you can actually crank the speed up if you want to, but not legally. But we also think that the big part of this will become this personal pool taxi idea, this sharing of vehicles going around. And I would also venture to guess, these are pictures here of the Waymo, the Pacifica van, the Waymo Google car, the little one. But the evolution of the architectures of these vehicles, I think, will also change very dramatically because in some cases, the sharing may not mean we have to ride with 3 other people. The sharing just may mean that the vehicle picks me up and I want to be by myself because I'm going to be on a conference call, or I just want to be by myself, and it'll take me somewhere. And that model is the one we're in today because most of us drive ourselves. We don't really share the ride into work. And we don't want to. Sometimes it's because it takes time, but sometimes I can't find anybody I like to go with. But that also drives, from a consumer standpoint, then if we start doing more of that, I would argue that maybe the architectures of the vehicles change quite dramatically because now we're back to the Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report. Maybe I only need a single passenger vehicle. And it only needs to be this wide in that case, right? So now you have a different set of lanes infrastructure-wise, and it's my own shared autonomous vehicle, but it drops me off and picks somebody else up and takes them up individually. And you can see, I can see that happening quite frequently because especially as you get older, I think when you're younger, you want the socialization part of it, and when you get older, you kind of want to be by yourself sometimes. So there's an interesting evolution of the requirements that we may drive as consumers. But the last part I'll talk about as well is I think that the city transit bus definitely will disappear sometime over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. Because if you look at the city transit bus, for example, and living near Detroit, and I see it if you live, even in Jackson has some bus routes, but that bus is empty so much of the time. It is probably one of the worst utilized mechanisms to get people around. And we're paying a driver to drive around this $300,000 bus that gets 5 miles to the gallon because it's on a fixed route to go pick up people that are never there. So they're there sometimes. They're there in the morning from 6 to 9, and they're there in the evening from like 4 to 7 for the most part. And the rest of the time, the utilization is really terrible. So I could easily see this becoming the public autonomous transport, which could be the size of a minivan, and you just put more of them online when it's busy, and you take them offline to go get cleaned up, to recharge, repaired, or whatever when they're not there, or to take shipments around. There's all kinds of different ways to utilize a smaller vehicle like that, and you're not paying the driver anymore either. So our team developed this. It's based upon a nonlinear projection, It's a series of the engineers in here will love this, okay, because it's using a series of causal variables and differential equations to build out this. It was a model developed about 50 years ago by a professor at Purdue University. It's called the Bass diffusion model. It's quite interesting, and it attempts to project based upon these different characteristics in here that you might have around autonomous aspects, especially cost and customer willingness and technology maturity, as well as the mobility side around enabled miles and competitive market passenger miles, and we'll talk about that a bit. But it's to drive nonlinear growth. Not linear, as Jeff was talking about, that slow growth kind of thing, but what happens when something makes a sea change in a marketplace? Oh, like this guy, too. Right? So in 2006, nobody had one of these because it didn't exist. And in 2007, I made fun of it because I loved my BlackBerry. And it took me another 3 years to convert, and it's like, why did I wait so long? So that's the kind of change that we're trying to figure out here, and we're all talking about. The question is the when. So the colors got kind of screwed up in the translation here. My apologies. So they're all supposed to be these colors over here on the right side. So the orange up, this light yellow orange is actually supposed to be black. I don't know how it converted like that. And the orange in here is supposed to be this gray. So it's shared autonomous in here, and this is private autonomous up here, and this is non-autonomous, the blue. And this is based upon miles traveled. So our team, I would call them mainly millennials, looked at this and kind of said, what's really driving the industry? And we think about it in vehicles and parts and those kinds of things. And they think about it in how do I get someplace? And how long does it take me, or how far is it away? So they converted this over to how many miles get traveled. And you can see the white bars here are 2025. So frankly, it's kind of the same old for the next 7, maybe 10 years even. So there's a runway out here. It's not like there's a crisis happening, next year, or tomorrow. But the runway does end. Just like any runway, it's not a gradual end when it ends, if you're on the plane. And so if the plane's not getting off the ground soon enough, you've got a problem. The runway ends abruptly. And this is the abrupt change that we think occurs somewhere with autonomous out here, probably in the early 30s, some time frame in there. That's what our model is projecting. We can change that if we change some of the factors, but it's based upon, so who takes autonomous vehicles and who drives in cars? And you see the huge growth in miles traveled up here, really driven by, I'd call it by not just population growth, but by taking market share. So it's taking market share away from mass transit, city buses, light trains. It's taking market share away from short flights. Like, why do you fly from Detroit to Lansing when it's a 1-hour drive? But there's still flights, there's 4 flights a day, I think, something like that. So there's no need for those kinds of things in the future. This is a huge growth in miles traveled. And a lot of it, as you get out in the future, is this thing called the shared autonomous model. There's private vehicles too, because some people still want to own their own vehicles and miles and it gets traveled. But we think the whole idea of a privately driven car that you control yourself, because of some of the, not only the safety characteristics are really driving, or safety requirements are driving the technology, which then says, why do you want to drive yourself? There's really no reason if you're just trying to get from where you are now to work or to go to the store. The fun for driving still exists, and we think that there'll be vehicles out here because they'll be out there, but it'll be more like owning a horse today. Because does anybody own a horse here? And do you keep your horse next to your house? Oh, you probably live on a farm then. That's not fair. But if you own a horse, most of the time it's going to be a farm. It's got to be out away from it's not in the middle of the city, right? So it's not your major mode of transportation, I don't think, is it? Okay. So you do it for fun because you love horses, right? And there are people like us, I love cars too. My kids think I'm nuts, right? But I love my car, even though I had a flat tire this morning. But it'll be more for fun. So there'll be some of those vehicles out here. What this model also predicts, though, is vehicles in operation that are out here on the road, in the park, if you think, and population, will go down by probably 50%. This is going up to 2050. You probably did notice that in here. We decided we wanted to take it out way in the future because it's hard to see change happening in 10 years and 15. But what happens if it keeps going? And what happens in our society and to us as an industry if we really go out that far? But yeah, if it's half as much, then some of the naysayers that say this is the demise of the industry could say that might be correct because the number of vehicles in operation, they're really busy out here. They're not running, as I mentioned to some of the guys at lunch, the average vehicle last year ran for 56 minutes a day, 1 hour approximately, right? 4% on a 24-hour day utilization. If our factories ran at 4%, Craig would probably fire the guys, right? So, But we don't think we can get to 100% because that's probably not realistic. We're not going to stay awake 24 hours a day. But even if you take conservative numbers, which we did in the model, if we go to 5 hours a day, okay, so that's 5 times as much utilization. 12,000 miles a year is the average for a vehicle, so 5 times, so 60,000 miles a year on the vehicle in that case. And vehicles today, average life is 180,000 miles. So 60, 3-year life, not 15 years. Vehicles are going to wear out. The metals, having worked in metals before, it fatigues, plastics wear out. Maybe there's aftermarket for a lot of that stuff, but at some point, it's kind of like any kind of repair. You're going to say, enough, got to replace it. Time to get rid of it, move on. So our model actually took into account then how long does the vehicle last, how many miles per day does it end up being driven. We went up to 40% was kind of the max in here, so that's about 10 hours on utilization way out in the future if we really get good at this stuff. And we actually increased the life of the vehicle to 400,000. We actually went to 700,000 and 800,000 miles to see what would happen in the model. This is at 400,000 miles for a vehicle. That means we have to make our cars, on average, last 400,000 miles versus 180 today. That's a lot, don't you think? Most people say the car's going to wear out pretty quick, but it's putting a lot of miles on. It's putting on 100, 120,000 miles a year. So the average is about 3.5 years for the life of a car, which is why we create this churn in here. So actually, annual new vehicle sales go up in this world, in this model here. That's why I say it's not so bad if you look at it and try to figure out what's really the life of the vehicle and how long is it going to last. And it's still a lot of shared that's out here. We've worked with our clients. We'll have working sessions where we'll actually input, what do you think is going to be different, and see what the impact is. And so if you take it down at like 200,000 miles like today, then it was kind of unreal. Annual new vehicle sales just skyrocketed. Because it's kind of like the vehicles, they don't last but a year and a half in that case. So we wanted to temper the expectations a little bit. But we think this is a tremendous opportunity. But the vehicles are very different in the future. They also have electric. As I mentioned earlier, this is taking the same model and adopting electrification powertrains to it, using a different set of variables to add to the equation in this case. But you can see in this case, we're already fairly well down the road, but it's not. If I look at that, internal combustion engines still dominate the architectures of the vehicles in 25. The sea change occurs out here in the mid-30s, mainly driven by cost factors. When does cost parity really occur between battery and electric, and when does the infrastructure also come into play? So when do these things all come into play? And this is US. So if we do this for Europe and for China, for other countries as well, but in Europe and China, we've done the same forecasts for our clients there. It's about 5 to 7 years earlier. It's going to be probably more like the early 30s, late 20s, where you'll see a major change in this case, nonlinear now, where suddenly the runway ended and there's a major change in the way we operate our vehicles in the future. And the implications, Craig talked about it as well. These are internal combustion engine components. You make some of these parts today. Not one of these is needed on an electric vehicle. 0. For our clients that make engines and transmission components, I'm amazed sometimes how that surprises them, that they didn't quite understand that's what's going to occur in the future. But there's a runway, so it's not time to panic, it's a time to position. How do you position your company then in the future? Because the future is going to be these kinds of things. Battery packs, traction motors, inverters. There is a gearbox. We didn't get a picture of that up here. It's probably a 1-speed, maybe a 2-speed gearbox. So, clutches, not so much need for clutches in the future. And the impact for them and for suppliers really comes around, this is a Disney concept, around content per vehicle. And so we also work this into what's the financial implication to your company on content per vehicle. And this is an example here of transmission, suspension, engine changes over this time frame based upon the forecast, and then where your electric components, where you could position yourself to grow in the future. A couple other slides in here we'll whip through just conceptually because it's been talked about already, but architectures. Current ICE architecture, fairly complex with engines and transmissions. This is a frame, it's a truck. Electric vehicles, this idea of a skateboard chassis. This is the Faraday Future chassis. I don't know if they'll ever come to production with it, if you keep track of Faraday, but there's a few other skateboard chassis ideas out there. So they're not the only ones. It's just that it's really quite interesting because this is a battery pack and it's got a traction motor underneath here, but the whole idea is that if I have an autonomous shared vehicle, and we talked about it, do I care what it looks like? when I get into it? Do I care what my Uber vehicle looks like? Somebody asked about, right? No, when I get in now, I want it to be clean. I don't want to sit on a piece of gum. You know, that's happened to me too. So, you know, that was kind of a mess in my suit. But you know, there's an opportunity to build a much higher volume, kind of common architecture for these vehicles that will never exceed the speed limit, will never over accelerate at certain times, and it'll always communicate and be connected with other vehicles out there. Here's a picture on interiors. And Jeff showed that earlier. We like to show this one just to show the evolution for generations. Going back to this is some of the Chevy interiors, very traditional, we all drive today, more technology. A little nicer in this one here because we went from the cheap plastic now up to like nicer surfaces up here finally. That consumers kind of say we want that stuff. This is a Model 3 from Tesla. This kind of shook up the interior business, I would say, Jeff. When the Tesla said it, but when people actually looked at it, who's gotten into a Model 3 in here? It's interesting, isn't it, when you sit down in there? What do you look for, right? Because all you got's the screen. It is barren. There's nothing else up there. And I've been in some other test environments as well. This is where the interiors are going. A much cleaner piece of this. You know, no knobs, vent louvers, things that kind of break. You know, that stuff is all going to be disappearing. And this is the future, which Jeff showed a lot of, potentially is the third living space, right? That whole idea of a living area. So it's all about the experience in the future. And your experience isn't going to be under the hood. It's not going to be, it's not going to be part of the engine. It's going to be the interior of the vehicle itself. The implication for suppliers especially, going from now to the future, and we like this chart because it really shows we're going from vehicles produced to miles driven, to this idea of mobility as a service, to this idea of skateboard platforms, and we think down here, this idea of, the OEMs cannot afford to do everything, to do all of it. And we think that some OEMs may choose to be vehicle guys, and some will choose to be, I want to be in that mobility as a service area. I want to be part of that group that's making all the money, charging you for rides in the future. And how much revenue and profit can they make off of something like that, which is exactly where, it's not only the data we think, but it's also the service side that a Waymo and these others are looking at. So this chart also shows the value chain and where you may be as a supplier in here versus how does it feed into this idea of mobility as a service and mobility operations. And somebody still has to build vehicles, somebody has to own them, but then there's all a set of services. It's the data, but it's also, who's going to make sure that the rides happen, who's going to clean the vehicle and repair it in the future, who's going to operate these things, and who's going to be optimizing the traffic and the route flows and the like. So we use our structure around strategy and strategic planning. We use this usually as a kickoff to the organization to think about, okay, what's the future look like? Now let's make it back to how do we work our business models and our business strategies into the future. So with that, I think we have some Q&A.
You talked about about vehicle volumes potentially going up. Do you have some sense of magnitude? Is it, we're at 17 million today. Could it be over 20 million?
Yeah, actually it's interesting. So in the model itself, it depends upon the drivers you put in there. So we're at 17.2 is what it generally, Jeff, that's probably generally people are thinking today for this year. In the model, it actually climbs up to close to 25 million. But there's a mixture then of these privately driven and autonomous vehicles. So you get this double whammy for a while. And we think it flatlines, in this model anyway, in the US, probably around 23, 24 million. And then it gets to be more of a constant state because your vehicles it's all about miles driven. So if we increase the transportation needs, if we have an influx, more people want to use vehicles. If the older population, as we get older, we start using more, we travel more maybe, it could go up higher than that. But probably somewhere in that, I'd say mid-20s is probably, in the model, the way we set it up today is a plateau.
Okay. So if you're a supplier in the tier 1, tier 2 space, and you're looking at future volumes potentially going up, is it, and obviously the vehicle changing, where do you see the biggest subsystems or vehicle systems that are going to be impacted by that kind of growth, and how that infrastructure looks?
Well, it's interesting. The whole idea of using skateboards and common architectures or common platforms, for example, on an electric drive, even though that Tesla would go out and say we can use their crazy level of speed, 0 to 60 in 2.7 seconds, right? With 2 traction motors and it's all-wheel drive.
Ludicrous mode.
Ludicrous mode, thank you, yeah. But in an autonomous world, I don't care about that so much, right? That's just kind of for fun. So we think that the electric drive, the drivetrain, has a potential probably of really being commonized into much higher volumes actually than what they are today. So the key to that one would be being the supplier on components for that, kind of quote, if you want to say anything about the standard drivetrain of the future, maybe instead of thinking about, we're thinking too small, instead of thinking about 200,000 units a year, it's 2 million, right? It's 5 million. I mean, that kind of a world in the future with all these common architectures is huge for the guys who win. The guys who lose, it's zero, right? So that's a big problem. The interiors, we think, on the flip side, probably have lots of variation and variety, because now it's all about your experience in the future. It's all about what you like yourself and how that can be, how can it fit your lifestyle and your world. So if you're a young person, you may, like my kids, they want to go places with their friends, right? So it's more of a social environment. As I said earlier, maybe it's because I'm getting old, so I like to go by myself a lot of times, right? So there may be more of a private environment, but the technology access, the comfort, how the air feels inside the vehicle is going to be huge. It won't be it can't be the traditional old vent louvers where the air's blowing in the face on the passenger, right? And the guys in the back seat can't feel anything. So there's going to be technologies around some of that on the interior space to really make it a great experience for the comfort side. So there's real opportunities, we think, on the interior side for differentiation.
Okay. So you and Jeff both talked about, disruption and the OEM, the horse and buggy thing. And so I'll ask you a similar question to what I asked him. We have these traditional OEMs, right? So which ones do you think are best positioned to be on the right side of that equation and be the ones who actually move into this new mobility world?
Yeah, that's the crystal ball out.
You said you didn't want softball questions.
I know that. Thank you. And you've complied. He's right. GM has probably been the leader as far as investing heavily in the autonomous side. That doesn't mean that they have an insurmountable lead by any means, right? So I think one of the challenges for all the OEMs is that, and having worked in their environments as well, is they don't have enough capital to do everything on that last slide I showed, right? To be they can't be the supplier, the designer, the maker, the owner of the fleets in the future for sharing, the service provider for the fleets, they think, and the data holders for all that stuff. So they're going to look at it, and which GM and I think Ford and BMW, a number of others are all looking at it very aggressively. Where do they make the most money in the future? And how do they drive shareholder value up, right? What's going to juice up the stock price, which is pretty terrible today, right? Hopefully you don't own too much GM or Ford stock, but it's not doing well. So the question is, where do they position themselves along the value chain? Because I don't believe that any of the OEMs can actually afford to do all of that. So then I think they're going to probably choose to go more toward the right side, as you saw up here, which then means where's the gap? Who's going to design? Who's going to build all these vehicles out here? So the definition of an OEM, original equipment manufacturer, may look a lot different in the future. So I don't know there really will be OEMs. Supplier may be the OEM in this case, right? The supplier can come out with a standardized architecture to build all these pieces or pieces of it. Because if I had a skateboard architecture and I just had different top hats to put on top of it and different interiors to plug into it, it's much more modular, then it's a whole different kind of business model in that case. So, but I would say if I were going to go back to your question, so I'll answer, the domestic US guys are definitely aggressively looking at it, except for Chrysler, as Jeff said. FCA is very happy being the provider to Waymo without getting any access to their technology. The Germans, the Europeans, the Renaults and PSAs are looking aggressively at this stuff as well. The Japanese are the ones that aren't sure what this whole mobility as a service means to them yet. So they're the ones that, now they can catch up, but I think they also are always ones that have always struggled a little bit with trying to be the leader of the pack on some of these things. So that could be a real risk to the big Japanese OEMs. They may wind up being, it may not be a bad thing to just be if you may call them tier 2 or tier 1, but maybe they're still the OEM. They just make the product because somebody has to make millions and millions of these products out here. And we think that model fits across the globe. So if we had a growth like that across the globe, we'd wind up with a $150 million industry in a number of years. 150 million unit industry, sorry.
You brought up something interesting that I was going to ask. So we've got these sort of mega tier 1 suppliers, right? These super tier 1s, and they're multi-billion-dollar companies, mergers that have occurred. Back in the old days, we had Magna that was the 0.5 tier supplier. So is there a chance that these guys really become much more of a partner with these traditional OEMs to be able to help provide this mobility?
Yeah, I think you may not see all that happen in 2019, but I think that over the next 5 to 7 years, you'll see a lot more of that. So if it's 0.5 may become, they just, they come together, and that's just another layer in the whole value chain or supply chain that's out there. Mm-hmm. So I think the big guys especially are looking at integration going far beyond kind of their current definitions of integration out here. And they're going to need other suppliers below them to help support even higher levels. So as they move up that direction, they can't afford to do it all either. So they're going to be relying on someone who makes better components in certain areas or better subsystems that plug into their systems or into their vehicles if they get into that kind of business.
So last question then. Craig talked about it a little bit before you spoke. How do companies like Team One and many of the other suppliers that are out here align themselves with these disruptors? So how do they know how to identify them? How do they know who to connect with?
Yeah, I think the first, this is not AA, Craig, but, but the first step is kind of acknowledging there's a problem, right? Because some suppliers, I've been in discussions where they've gotten into shouting matches, right? Because one end of the table kind of says, that's a lot of crap out there, right? I don't believe any of that's going to happen. Hasn't happened for the last 20 years. It's not going to happen again. A lot of dealers are thinking that way, frankly, if you listen to some of the dealers out there. So they don't quite get it yet. So first of all, it's acknowledging there's a potential problem or challenge out there. Then I think and what we like to do with our clients in this case is just go through the same process and let's lay out, where's your value add in the whole industry today? What is it you supply, and what are you really good at doing? And then go through the discussion of where do we think the industry's going, and how does that align up with what you're doing well, and where can you potentially position your core competencies and capabilities to really engage with that in the future. Got to survive today, got to keep growing today with some of those same components because you have those programs that are already awarded. But they may not get awarded in 22 and 23, right? So that's the whole transition is the difficult part, and laying out a real game plan for how that's going to occur. And that's going to occur with not only the organization and your products, but your people, because your people skills will be dramatically different in the future too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So we're going to take a brief break. I want to remind you guys to please put more questions in. We're going to have a panel here after this short break with all of our speakers to wrap up the day. So if not, I can just call on you because I know some of you have questions. So we'll take a break and do a little bit of furniture moving.
10 minutes, and then we'll be right back here, and we'll wrap up with the final panel. Final cage match.